Sometimes disappearing is the most important gesture in human existence, and nobody tells you that. What I'm about to show you now will rearrange everything you think you know about existing. Why are you so tired even when you sleep enough? Why does everything feel out of place even when you do everything right? Before disappearing, everything is noise. After, everything is center. Between these two extremes, there's a crossing that two thinkers already mapped out in silence. Hermes Trismegistus, in the Hermetic tradition, and Jakob Böhme, the German mystic of the 17th century, both describe the same operation you need to perform right now. After I understood what these two were teaching, I realized that impossible things became simple. The fit I was forcing, the belonging I was begging for, all of it rearranged itself on its own. There's a disappearing that destroys, and there's another that rebuilds. It's about the second one, the sacred one, the alchemical one, that this crossing was made. Start with the symptom. There's a tiredness that doesn't sleep. It's not in the body, it's not in the bones, it's not in that fatigue a hot shower can fix. It lives in a deeper place, in a windowless room inside the chest, and nobody dares to say its name out loud because saying it would mean admitting it. It's the tiredness of existing publicly, the tiredness of being seen, of being explained, of being a version of yourself all the time for eyes that never even asked to look. You wake up exhausted before you even open the app. You feel the weight of the next reply before the next message even arrives. And nobody warned you that this has a name. You're not tired of life, you're tired of performing life. And until you understand that difference, you'll keep fixing it from the wrong side. The blue light of the phone hits your face at 11 at night, and you're still scrolling, even when you don't want to scroll. You close the app, then open the same app again 30 seconds later, as if something had changed, as if there were an answer waiting there. There isn't. What there is the echo of a performance you don't even remember starting. At some point, between the ages of 12 and your early 20s, someone convinced you that existing meant being witnessed. And ever since then, you've been living in a display window whose door not even you can find anymore. The symptom is silent. It doesn't come with a fever. It comes with that little hesitation before posting, with that thin restlessness before opening WhatsApp, with that strange relief when the signal drops, and for one whole minute nobody can reach you. That relief is your soul talking. Learn to listen. The contemporary human being confuses visibility with existence. Deep down, he believes that if no one sees him, he dissolves. And that's why he fights a daily, invisible battle against his own vanishing. Posting, commenting, giving opinions, showing, justifying, explaining. Every gesture is a signature on a contract that says, "I'm still here, please don't erase me." But there's a cruel paradox at the center of this logic. The more you show up, the less you see yourself. The more you're seen by others, the more invisible you become to yourself. There's an old word for the state of someone who lost his own face in the crowd of his own appearances. The mystics called it the exile of the soul. Today we call it a normal life. Look at your routine. You wake up and the first thing you touch isn't your own face, nor your own breath. It's the screen. Before you even exist for yourself in the day that's beginning, you've already existed for hundreds of others. You watched their stories, read their opinions, absorbed their moods, took on their demands. Before coffee, you've already taken a stance on 5 subjects. Before your shower, you've already reacted to 3 news items. Before you set foot on the floor, your mind has already run a half marathon across other people's territories. And then, when you finally sit on the bed and try to feel your own body, you discover that you can't, because you spent the entire first hour of the day outside of yourself. And this is where a law that the modern world made a point of forgetting comes in. A law so old it precedes any science, any institutionalized religion, any academic philosophy. It's written, according to the Hermetic tradition, on an emerald tablet attributed precisely to Hermes Trismegistus, that mythical figure who synthesizes the wisdom of ancient Egypt and whom I mentioned at the beginning. The phrase is short and devastating. As above, so below. As within, so without. This means that what you see happening in your external life is not the cause of your internal state. It's the reflection. Material reality, according to this ancient wisdom preserved in texts like the Corpus Hermeticum, works like a faithful mirror of what's happening on the deepest floors of your consciousness. If your life seems out of place, if nothing fits, if the right people don't show up and the wrong ones insist on staying, it's not the world that's crooked. It's the inner axis that hasn't been reordered yet. This idea today sounds strange to the modern ear. We were trained to think from the outside in. We believe that external conditions determine the internal state. If I have more money, I'll be at peace. If I find the right person, I'll be complete. If I move to another city, I'll change my life. And then we move to another city, we find the person, we get the money, and we discover, with a frustration we won't even admit under our breath, that the restlessness remains. Because the restlessness was never in the external. The external was only reflecting. Hermetic wisdom whispers, from the other side of the millennia, that as long as you believe the source is outside, you'll spend your entire life chasing mirrors. And the most common mistake, the mistake that destroys an entire life without that life ever noticing, is trying to fix the mirror. You try to force the pieces to fit. You try to fit into places that aren't yours. You try to convince people to love you with arguments. You try to adjust your appearance, your speech, your posture, your opinions. Everything in the hope that the reflection will finally show the right image. But the mirror doesn't invent anything. It only gives back. And as long as the source stays the same, the reflection will stay the same, no matter how many times you wipe the glass. Trying to force yourself to fit in is anti-alchemy. The ancient alchemists, those workers of the invisible who labored in dark cellars transmuting metals and symbols, knew something we've forgotten. Nothing is transformed by pressure. Gold isn't born from the hammer. Lead doesn't turn into light through insistence. Transmutation happens through slow fire, through an internal operation that respects the rhythm of the matter. When you try to force belonging, you're doing the opposite of the work. You're deforming the little bit of gold that still exists in you, in a desperate attempt to turn it into lead that's acceptable to the human market around you. And there's a price for that. Every time you contort yourself to fit, something essential in you breaks silently. The sound of that breaking is what you mistake for tiredness. I know this is hard to hear. Maybe right now, this very second, you're doing the silent math of how many times this week you made yourself smaller to fit somewhere. How many times you lowered your voice so as not to bother anyone. How many times you swallowed an opinion so as not to stand out. How many times you smiled when your body was asking for silence. And the worst part is that nobody forced you. You did it by yourself, automatically, like a reflex trained over years. That's the level of domestication that modern tiredness produces. It no longer needs jailers. You're your own. And the key to the cell is inside your pocket, but you forgot it exists. And further along, I'm going to show you the silent mistake that destroys exactly the person who's close to making it all the way through this entire crossing. But there's a place inside you that this tiredness can't reach. A place no display window can light up, that no social media can measure, that no performance can fill. Jakob Böhme, that German mystic I cited at the start, a shoemaker by trade and a visionary by destiny, gave a disturbing name to this place. He called it the Ungrund. The word is hard to translate, but it means something like bottomless abyss or groundless ground. It's the void that precedes all form. It's the darkness that exists before any light. And Böhme, in works like Aurora and Mysterium Magnum, taught something that even today seems absurd to anyone hearing it for the first time. That emptiness you feel, that hollow sensation in the middle of your chest, that nothing that insists on showing up even on the good days, that's not a defect of your soul. That is the raw material of your transmutation. Modernity taught you to run from the void. Whenever it shows up, you run to the phone, to work, to conversation, to any noise that drowns out that uncomfortable silence. But Böhme would say that by running from the void, you're running from the only place where the real, or your true self, can be born. Because everything that's authentic needs the abyss first. All creation begins in a fertile darkness. The womb is dark. The seed germinates in the dark. Alchemical gold only appears after everything has turned to blackness first. And this first operation has a name. Think for a moment. When was the last time you spent 5 minutes straight with no stimulus at all? 5 minutes with no music, no podcast, no screen, no conversation, not even a book. Just you, the air, and the silence. For most people, the honest answer is frightening. Years, decades, maybe never. We live in an era where the void became a public threat, and any blank space has to be filled immediately. But think about it. How are you going to hear an inner voice if there was never any silence where it could sound? How are you going to find your center if you never stopped running long enough to feel where it is? You don't have an identity problem. You have a noise problem. Silence the noise, and the identity shows up on its own, like a fish that rises to the surface when the water finally stops rippling. The alchemists called it nigredo, the blackening. It's the phase where the matter has to rot, dissolve, lose its previous form, so that something new can be born. And when this happens in a human life, that's exactly what it feels like. The certainties start to fall. Relationships that seemed solid suddenly go cold. That job that gave you meaning becomes unbearable. The old friends feel like strangers. Your own identity, the one you built over years, starts to feel like a piece of clothing that no longer fits, loose at the shoulders, tight at the chest, ridiculous in the mirror. This is not necessarily deep burnout, although it can look like it, and sometimes it really does need professional support. In its symbolic dimension, this is initiatory dissolution. It's the necessary putrefaction that precedes every true transmutation. You're not breaking. You're being taken apart so you can be put back together in a different way. The difficulty is that the world around you has no language for this. When you say you're tired, they offer you a vacation. When you say you're sad, they offer you therapy. When you say you don't know who you are anymore, they offer you a self-help book. And none of that is necessarily wrong, but none of that reaches what's actually happening. What's happening is an internal operation that runs on an older register, in a deeper language, on a plane that the modern manuals don't cover. You're crossing through an initiatory phase with no initiator, no master, no community that recognizes what you're going through. In the old days, there were rituals for this. Today, there's only the silence of your room at 3 in the morning. And even so, even in this almost total cultural abandonment, the work continues, because the soul carries the script within itself. You just have to stop interrupting it with quick fixes. And the world around you seems to conspire against this process. Notice it. Whenever you try to go quiet, something screams. Whenever you try to withdraw, someone calls you. Whenever you try to think, a notification interrupts you. Contemporary civilization built, maybe without knowing, maybe knowing all too well, a sophisticated system of anti-silence. There's a structural logic to this. Attention became a commodity, and a commodity needs constant flow. You are the raw material of this market dynamic. Every second of your gaze has a price. Every moment of silence is a loss for someone. That's why the world screams. Not out of anyone's individual malice, but because of a machine that needs your noise to keep running. The Hermetic tradition taught the exact opposite. Truth, according to this view, only speaks in silence. The divine, according to this view, doesn't compete with the noise of the world. It waits. It stays motionless in the deepest center of you, waiting for you to switch off the inner television, to close the window of other people's opinions, to stop for 1 second consuming ready-made thoughts, and then and only then, a voice that isn't a voice begins to manifest. The ancients knew this. That's why they built monasteries in mountains. That's why they fasted. That's why they withdrew from the world for seasons at a time. It wasn't escape. It was spiritual engineering. They understood that without silence, no internal operation happens. Just agitation disguised as life. And here's the point that a lot of people resist accepting. For silence to work, it has to be chosen. The accidental silence of a bored Sunday isn't enough. It takes decided silence, conscious withdrawal, the deliberate retreat from the display window. And that retreat, before it's comfortable, is frightening. Because when you stop showing up, you quickly discover how many of your connections depended exclusively on your appearance. Messages stop coming, invitations dwindle. Your name disappears from the conversations, and the soul at first interprets this as rejection. But it isn't, it's filtering. It's the first sieve of transmutation. I understand perfectly when you feel that fear, the fear of vanishing and discovering that no one really noticed. The fear of going quiet and realizing that your value was only in the noise. The fear of withdrawing and hearing the silence on the other side, with no worried messages, no "I miss you" calls, none of that continuous validation that kept the ego breathing. It's completely valid to feel this. But think, if your presence was only noticed while you were performing, then what was being noticed wasn't you. It was the character. And losing the character's audience is the only way to find out who's underneath the costume. Whatever it hurts, that's the first gift of disappearing. The naked truth about what was real and what was theater. The alchemists worked in hidden laboratories, in cellars, in towers, far from the curious eyes of the city. There was a technical reason for that, of course, but there was also a much deeper symbolic reason. The work needs privacy. The plant doesn't grow if you dig up the root every week to check on its progress. The fetus doesn't form in a display window. The inner gold can't take the public light while it's still forming. When you withdraw from the social display window, you're not isolating yourself pathologically. You're creating the environment the operation needs in order to happen. And that withdrawal doesn't have to be absolute. You don't have to go live in a cave. But it is necessary to create zones of invisibility within everyday life. Hours when nobody knows what you're doing. Days when you don't answer to anyone. Thoughts you don't share. Decisions you don't announce. Little by little, inside that space, you finally begin to see yourself. Maybe for the first time in your entire adult life. There's an enormous difference between imposed solitude and chosen solitude. The first one wounds. The second one forms. The first one is rejection. The second one is architecture. When you decide to withdraw for a greater reason, for an inner work, for a conscious crossing, solitude changes its nature at the deepest level. It stops being the absence of other people and becomes the concentrated presence of yourself. It's as if the soul, once diluted across 1,000 other people's gazes, finally manages to gather itself into a single point, dense enough to start glowing from within. The ancients knew this. They didn't flee from people out of contempt. They fled out of technical necessity. The work demanded concentration, and concentration demands distance from the sources of dispersion. And what you see isn't necessarily beautiful at first. Here's the most painful point of the entire crossing. When you silence the external noise, the internal noise shows up at 3 times the volume. Memories that were stored away come back. Feelings you didn't want to feel knock on the door. Old versions of you, masks you wore at some point in life and forgot to take off, appear in front of the inner mirror demanding an accounting. Böhme taught, with the brutal clarity of the true mystics, that the old man has to reach his end so the new one can be born. And that symbolic end is not a metaphor in the soft sense the word has taken on today. It's a real ending. Something in you actually has to stop existing. The character you built to survive childhood, the version you created to be accepted at school, the role you took on to please the family, the identity you fabricated to survive at work. All of that has to be looked at, recognized as a creation and not as an essence, and then buried with the proper inner ceremony. Recognize the masks one by one. That child who learned to be funny because laughter was the only way to avoid conflict at home. That teenager who learned to make himself smaller because standing out attracted pressure. That young adult who learned to look busy because looking idle attracted consequences. That professional who learned to smile in meetings, even when something deep inside was screaming for silence. Each one of these masks saved you at some point. Each one served a function, and that's why it deserves gratitude, not contempt. But the correct gratitude for a mask that served you is to bury it when its time has passed. Continuing to wear the old mask in new territories is what produces that sense of permanent fakeness so many people carry without knowing how to name it. And here's where a lot of people get stuck. Because putting an end to a version of yourself hurts. Even when that version made you suffer for years, it's familiar, it's known, and the human being prefers known suffering to the luminous unknown. That's why so many people give up halfway through. That's why so many people taste a piece of the silence, feel the discomfort, and run back to the noise with the excuse that the silence wasn't for them. But silence is for everyone. What isn't for everyone is the courage to cross all the way through it. And there's a point in this crossing, which I'll reveal in a moment, where everything can collapse if you don't know how to recognize it in time. In alchemy, there's a central instrument called the athanor. It's the furnace where transmutation happens, a special furnace, designed to maintain constant and prolonged heat, because the work isn't done in an explosion, but in slow maceration. The human equivalent of the athanor is exactly prolonged silence, chosen solitude, the withdrawal that becomes discipline. Without that inner furnace, no real transformation happens, just oscillation, just superficial reforms, just that illusion of change that lasts 3 weeks and then collapses back into the old form. True transmutation demands time inside the furnace. And the furnace is uncomfortable, it cooks, it bothers, it exposes. Imagine the following. On some random day, you decide you're going to spend a whole week without posting anything on social media, without commenting, without reacting, without showing up, without justifying your disappearance to anyone, just vanishing. On the second day, the restlessness comes. On the third, the feeling that something important is passing by without you. On the fourth, the uncontrollable urge to open the app, even just to look. On the fifth, maybe you give in and feel guilty afterward. On the sixth, if you resist, something changes. The body starts to relax. The mind starts to slow down. On the seventh, you discover that the world keeps turning perfectly fine without your public presence. And that discovery is, at the same time, liberating and painful. Liberating because it lifts off your shoulders a weight you didn't even know you were carrying. Painful because it ends a narcissistic fantasy that was holding up a good part of your identity. You're not as indispensable as you thought. And that end of the inflated ego is exactly what needed to dissolve. But after a while in this slow fire, something begins to change. The alchemists called this second phase albedo, the whitening. After the dark night, after the putrefaction, after the dissolution, a subtle brightness begins to appear at the bottom of the matter. Translated into human experience, this means that after a while of silence and withdrawal, the thoughts start to get cleaner. You notice that you react less. News that used to shake you now arrives and passes. People who used to throw you off balance now seem distant, almost like characters in an old movie. The emotions still exist, but they lose their murkiness. You start to distinguish what you feel from what you think you should feel. And that distinction, simple in the description but revolutionary in practice, changes everything. Böhme would call this moment dawn, the first ray after the long night. The albedo has a very specific quality. It's not happiness in the euphoric sense. It's more like lucid peace. You're not jumping for joy, but you're also not falling apart. You're there, present, whole, with a new sobriety. Things are still hard. The world is still imperfect. The bills still keep coming, but something inside you no longer trembles with the same ease. It's as if there were, finally, a foundation, as if you had built an inner floor where before there was only quicksand. And that stability didn't come from favorable external circumstances. It came from within, generated by the very process of dissolution and recomposition. That's why it can't be taken away from you by any adverse circumstance. Whoever was born from it learned the secret of the ancients. True peace doesn't depend on anything external. That's why, and only why, it's real. And it's at this moment that the old hermetic law begins to manifest on the external plane. Remember it? As above, so below. As within, so without. When the internal purifies itself, the external responds through resonance. And here you need to pay very close attention, because it's easy to interpret this as magical thinking, like those empty promises of quick manifestation that flooded the internet. That's not it. I'm not saying you'll think pretty thoughts and money will rain down. What I'm describing is more subtle, slower, and infinitely more real. When you change internally, your frequency of presence changes. Without realizing it, you start emitting different signals. People who connected with your old version start to drift away naturally, with no fights, no dramatic breakups, just through a gradual distancing that looks like coincidence but is actually correspondence. People who resonate with your new vibration start to show up, coming from unlikely places, at unlikely moments. Opportunities arrive without you having to chase them. Doors open without you having to push them. I know this is hard to hear, especially for someone who spent a lifetime believing that everything is effort, control, planning, sweat. I'm not saying effort is useless. I'm saying that misaligned effort is. You can spend decades pushing a door that opens the other way. And when you finally stop, step back, and look calmly, you realize the door was always unlocked, but it required a movement you couldn't make while you were blinded by your own pushing. Internal transmutation gives you vision, and with vision, effort becomes precise. You stop spending energy on battles that were never yours, and you start investing energy only where there's a real return. It's not laziness. It's operational intelligence earned in silence. Think of a tree. It doesn't chase after light. It grows. It occupies its own space. It stretches its branches at the rhythm of its own nature, and the light comes. The sun doesn't pick favorites. But crooked trees, planted in the wrong soil, symbolically suffocated by other larger plants, get less light. Not because the sun is unfair, but because their positioning in space blocks the reception. You are the tree, the sun is the real. And as long as you keep growing crooked in the attempt to fit into other people's molds, you'll always receive the minimum fraction of what could nourish you. Straighten yourself first. The light afterward will be a consequence, and here lies a silent danger that almost no one talks about, the danger of the half-transmutation. The Hermetic tradition warned about operators who abandon the work halfway through. The matter, when it starts to transmute and the process is interrupted, ends up in a worse state than it was before. It doesn't go back to the original state, but it doesn't reach the new one either. It stays in a corrupted limbo, unstable, sick. In human terms, this means the following. People who taste the silence start to withdraw, start to feel the first pains of dissolution, and then, out of fear, out of haste, out of the misunderstanding of family or friends, run back to the old noise. These people come back worse than they left. They come back with their sensitivity already altered, but without the new structure to support that sensitivity. They come back seeing too much and unable to stand what they see. That's why so many attempts at transformation end in bitter giving up, in cynicism, in total disbelief in the process itself. I'm not saying this to make you anxious, but to wake you up. The crossing has a point of no return, and going past it is safer than backing away from it. Backing away looks comfortable in the short term. It's going back to the known cave, to the familiar noise, to the old connections that still work even though they no longer serve you. But backing away leaves marks. The soul that tasted the silence and fled never hears the noise the same way again. There's a discomfort that sets in, a dissonance that doesn't pass, a permanent sense that something important was abandoned halfway through. That sensation is as heavy as continuing the work, maybe heavier, because it comes without the benefit of the transformation. Since it's going to hurt either way, choose the pain that produces gold, not the pain that just rusts. I understand perfectly when you feel like giving up. It's completely valid to feel this. The crossing is long and the world out there isn't going to applaud a single one of your steps. On the contrary, the more you silence yourself, the more the world will try to pull you back. Not out of malice, but because your noisy presence was part of other people's landscape, and they got used to it. When you change, you also change their scenery, and not all of them are going to like that. Be prepared to lose people who seemed essential. Be prepared for the discomfort of being misunderstood, without having any energy left to explain yourself. Be prepared to hear, from the people who love you, lines like "you're acting strange," "you've changed," "you're not the same anymore." And you'll need to smile on the inside, because that's exactly it. You're not the same anymore. That was the work. The loss of people is maybe the most underrated chapter of this journey. Nobody tells you that growing inwardly costs you relationships. Not because you start to despise the ones who stayed behind, but because the internal frequency changes, and not every relationship holds up across different frequencies. Some friendships existed only because the two of you shared the same pain, the same complaint, the same continuous grievance about life. When one of the two stops complaining, the foundation of the friendship disappears, and the friendship comes undone without anyone having done anything wrong. There's no blame. There's only the natural dynamic of affinities. New friendships will show up, and they'll be built on a different foundation, not on shared complaint, but on shared silence. And that new foundation holds much more weight. But before it, there's an interval of solitude, and that interval has to be crossed without running away. And then, on some random day, something beautiful happens. The solitude stops hurting. You're sitting alone, maybe drinking a coffee, maybe looking out the window, maybe just existing in a silent room, and you notice that there's no emptiness. There's presence. The solitude, once a weight, became a home. For Böhme, the soul that finds the divine within itself is never alone again, and that statement, which seems poetic, is actually descriptive. Whoever crossed the crossing discovers that the inner presence is enough company. Not that other people stop mattering. On the contrary, you start to love with more depth precisely because you no longer need them to fill a hole. Love becomes a choice, not an addiction. Presence becomes an offering, not a demand. The other becomes a guest, not a crutch. And it's at this point, after the nigredo of dissolution, after the albedo of clarity, that alchemy describes the third and last great phase of the great work. The rubedo, the reddening, the philosopher's stone. Here the transformed human being is no longer who he was before the crossing, but he's also not someone completely new. He's finally who he always was, underneath all the layers that life kept gluing on. It's the reappearing after the disappearing. You go back to being seen, but now the eyes that see you find something else. They find a more whole presence, denser, more quietly powerful. You speak less and say more. You post less and leave more of a mark. You show up less and have more impact. Because now, behind every word, there's a foundation. Behind every gesture, there's a center. Behind every presence, there's a real self, and no longer a self fabricated in response to external demands. The rubido has a color of its own. The ancients described it as red, as reddish gold, as the heat of an inner sun that lit up from the inside out. That sun is not a metaphor. It's the description of a real psychological state in which the person, finally, stopped living, hung on external opinion. There's a center of gravity there that belongs to the person himself. The storms keep coming. The crises still arrive. People are still unpredictable. But there's in the middle of the chest a point that doesn't move, an axis. The ancient Greeks called this the center of the logos. The Taoists would call it the inner Tao. The Hermeticists would call it fixed Mercury. Each tradition has its own name, but they all speak of the same experience, the discovery of an inviolable center within oneself. And here's where the literal reading of disappearing completely has to be undone. You didn't actually disappear. You became invisible to what didn't deserve you. You vanished from the radars that didn't truly see you. You faded out for the algorithms that wanted you only as a product. But you're more present than ever for what matters. The Hermetic tradition suggests that the wise man walks among men, but is no longer moved by them. You're still in the city. You're still in the conversations. You're still, maybe, on the same networks. But something essential has changed. You're no longer there asking. You're offering. You're no longer proving. You're being. You're no longer waiting to be chosen. You choose. And that difference, although it seems subtle, is the difference between a compressed life and a sovereign life. Between an existence held hostage to other people's approval and an existence anchored in its own center. Between trying to fit into the world's molds and simply occupying the space that was always yours, with no apologies, no performance. Inner sovereignty isn't arrogance, it's the exact opposite. It's the radical humility of someone who understood that he no longer needs to convince anyone of anything, because the only validation that ever mattered was always internal. External recognition, when it comes, is welcome. When it doesn't come, it's indifferent. You've already recognized yourself, and whoever recognizes himself no longer needs a witness. Whoever walks down this road knows there are moments when written words work like a silent compass, like a map from someone who already passed through the same terrain and marked the loose stones. If you're enjoying this content, check out our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes, in the first comment, and let's keep going. And so we arrive at the last operation, the surrender. After the entire crossing, after all the silence, after all the transmutation, there's still one last gesture, maybe the hardest of them all. Stop pushing. Let go. Let life fit together on its own, now that the inner axis is aligned. That letting go isn't passivity, it's not resignation. It's operational trust, one in the intimate laboratory of one's own soul. You've already done the inner work. Now the external just needs time to reorganize itself around you. It's not magic. It's physical, in the oldest sense of the word, in the sense the pre-Socratics used, when physis meant the deep nature of things, and not just the material world. The final surrender is hard because it goes against all modern conditioning. We were taught that everything has to be controlled, planned, executed on rigid deadlines. We were taught that resting is weakness, that waiting is a waste, that trusting is naive. But alchemy teaches the opposite. There's a moment within every work when the operator has to step back and let the matter cook on its own. If he interferes now, he ruins it. If he opens the furnace before its time, he loses everything. The last virtue of the alchemist is confident patience, the ability to wait without restlessness, because he knows the operation is already happening on the invisible level, and any hasty interference would only harm the result. Apply this to your life. You've done the inner work. You silenced, withdrew, dissolved, and reorganized what needed to be reorganized. Now comes the phase where life starts to fit together on its own, and you need to not get in the way. The temptation to force, to push, to control is going to show up. Resist it. Trust the process. The right people arrive at the right time. The right opportunities manifest when the internal structure is ready to support them. Forcing now would be like opening the cocoon before its time. The butterfly dies before it flies. Wait, trust, let it be. There's a silent and devastating principle that runs through this entire crossing. Whoever has transmuted himself no longer needs to fight for the place. The place comes to him, because the place was never geographic. It was always vibrational. It was always a matter of correspondence. And when the correspondence is re-established between your interior and the real begins to fit together with you, in you, around you, without you having to move a single muscle more. Notice another dimension of this surrender too. The more you let go, the lighter the path becomes. The weight you were carrying was mainly the weight of control. It was the continuous effort of trying to hold in your hands things that were never meant to be held. Relationships that needed space to breathe. Results that needed time to ripen. A public image that should never have been your priority. Recognition that comes from within before it comes from outside. All of these things, when grabbed, slip away. When let go, they come back on their own, on the right terms, at the right time. Life isn't a negotiation with fate, it's a dance. And whoever dances squeezing the partner steps on their foot all night long. Whoever dances lightly flows with the music, and the music is life happening at its own natural rhythm, which was never the hurried rhythm you imposed. So dissolve yourself. Get out of the places where you were never truly seen, the tables where you always sat diminished, the conversations that drained your energy without giving you presence back. Vanish from the display windows that asked for your image but never received you whole, from the noise that taught you to confuse agitation with life, from the rushing that robbed you of the silence that had always belonged to you, and trust the process. This disappearing isn't an end, it's a crossing. The necessary night before the inner dawn, a word Böhme chose as the title of his first great work, precisely because he understood that all light is born after a fertile darkness. The furnace where the gold sleeping in you wakes up, the silent Athenor the ancients spoke of, the silence where the true voice, the one hermetic wisdom said only speaks when the noise stops, can finally be heard. You won't come back worse, you'll come back whole for the first time. And in that return, everything that was yours, everything that was always yours by right of essence and not by forced conquest, will fit together with an ease that will scare you at first. Because after a whole lifetime of pushing, letting go feels strange. But that's how it should have been from the start, and that's how it will be from now on. Hermes Trismegistus, on the old emerald tablet, and Jakob Böhme, in his bottomless abyss, hand you the same silent key, separated by millennia but united on the only point that matters. When the inside reorganizes itself, the outside obeys. You dissolved yourself from what wasn't yours. Now, in silence, in peace, in center, let everything fit together.